They kicked me out naked, the poor woman cried. But before she froze on the street, a millionaire slammed his car door open and declared, "Get in my car now." Asterisk. What starts as a shocking rescue quickly spirals into something no one in town could have predicted. A woman with nothing suddenly finds herself inside a mansion filled with secrets, judgment, and whispers. But why does this powerful man remember her? And what unfinished dream ties them together? As gossip turns cruel and old enemies spread lies, she's faced with a choice: stay and fight for her dignity, or vanish forever. When the world has already stripped you of everything, can mercy and love truly rebuild a life? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The autumn wind rattled the windows of Brenda's Victorian home as Grace Wilkins sat rigid in her wooden chair, trying to make herself as small as possible at the grand dining table. The china clinked softly as Brenda cleared the dishes, each plate placed in the sink with deliberate force that made Grace wince. 3 months, Brenda said, her voice sharp as a knife. 3 whole months you've been here, eating our food, using our utilities. She turned from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel with quick, angry motions. When exactly do you plan on getting back on your feet, Grace? Grace's fingers twisted in her lap, her heart pounding against her ribs. The warm meal she'd just eaten now felt like lead in her stomach. I've been applying everywhere, Brenda. The hospital, the clinics, even the nursing homes. Oh yes, we've all heard about your applications. Brenda's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. 52 years old, and can't even land a simple nursing job. Maybe if you hadn't taken that extended leave. I was caring for Mom, Grace said quietly, her voice trembling. She needed me. And now look where that got you. No job, no house, no savings. Brenda tossed the dish towel onto the counter. Just living off relatives like some kind of parasite. The word struck Grace like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. The room felt too warm, too small. The walls closing in around her, her thin nightgown suddenly seemed inadequate armor against her cousin's verbal assault. I'm trying, Brenda. I really am. Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. The job market is tough right now, but I've got 2 interviews next week. More excuses. Brenda crossed her arms, her wedding ring catching the light as she drummed her fingers against her sleeve. You know what I think? I think you're comfortable here. Too comfortable. Living rent-free, eating our food, watching our TV. Grace's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Please, I just need a little more time. Just until. Until what? Brenda's voice rose, echoing off the walls. Until you've completely drained us dry? Until you've thoroughly embarrassed me in front of the whole town. Do you know what people are saying about us, Grace? About me? Heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Brenda's husband, Tom. His face dark with annoyance. What's all this racket about? She's not leaving, Tom. Brenda gestured dramatically at Grace. 3 months of freeloading, and she's still making excuses. Grace stood up, her legs shaky. Please, I don't have anywhere else to go. Just give me until the end of the week. No. Tom's voice was final, brooking no argument. This ends tonight. Before Grace could process what was happening, Tom disappeared up the stairs. She heard him stomping around above, then his heavy steps returning. In his hands was her small suitcase, the one she'd arrived with 3 months ago, still partially unpacked. Tom, please, Grace pleaded, but he was already moving toward the front door. The autumn wind howled through the house as he yanked it open and tossed her suitcase onto the porch. It landed with a dull thud that seemed to echo through Grace's entire body. "Out," he commanded, pointing to the door. Now, Grace stood frozen, unable to believe this was happening. She was wearing nothing but her thin cotton nightgown and house slippers, completely inappropriate for the bitter October night. "Can I at least change my clothes?" "You've had 3 months to prepare for this moment," Brenda said coldly. "Get out of my house." Tom's large hand wrapped around Grace's upper arm. Not quite rough, but brooking no resistance. She stumbled as he guided her firmly toward the door, her slippers scraping against the hardwood floors. The porch lights cast harsh shadows across the wooden boards as she found herself suddenly outside, the wind immediately cutting through her nightgown like icy knives. "Wait," she gasped, turning back, but the door slammed in her face. The lock clicked with devastating finality. Grace stood there for a long moment, shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the cold. Her suitcase lay on its side, a pathetic monument to her current state. With trembling hands, she picked it up, its weight seeming to represent all her failures, all her losses, all her shame. The street stretched before her, dark and empty, lit only by occasional street lamps that created pools of harsh yellow light. Each step down the porch stairs felt like walking through molasses, her mind unable to fully process what had just happened. The concrete sidewalk was cold beneath her thin slippers as she began walking, having no destination in mind, just an urgent need to get away from the house that had been her last refuge. Tears began flowing freely down her cheeks, turning icy in the autumn wind. "They kicked me out naked," she whispered to herself, the words carrying a surreal quality in the empty night. "They kicked me out naked." Her legs felt weaker with each step, the weight of her situation crushing down on her shoulders. The town's main road lay ahead, and beside it, she spotted a wooden bench. It was nothing special, just a simple public seat, but in that moment, it represented the last of her strength. Grace collapsed onto it, her suitcase falling beside her with a hollow thump. The wood was cold and hard beneath her, but she barely noticed. All her energy, all her hope, seemed to drain away into the night air. She sat there, utterly defeated, as cars occasionally passed by, their headlights sweeping over her huddled form without slowing. The wind continued its relentless assault, and Grace pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to preserve what little warmth she had left. Her thin nightgown offered no protection against the elements, and her slippers were already damp from the dewy grass she'd walked through. The tears had stopped, replaced by a numbness that seemed to spread from her core to her extremities. She thought about all the patients she'd cared for over the years, all the comfort she'd provided, all the lives she'd touched. Now, here she was, with no one to comfort her, no one to care for her. The irony might have made her laugh, if she weren't so cold, so tired, so completely drained of everything that had once made her strong. The bench became her island in a sea of uncertainty, the only solid thing in a world that had become increasingly unstable. Above her, the autumn trees swayed in the wind, their remaining leaves rustling like whispered judgments. A few broke free, swirling down to land near her feet, as lost and directionless as she felt. Grace Wilkins, former nurse, daughter, caregiver, sat alone in the dark, reduced to nothing more than what she could carry in a single suitcase and the thin nightgown on her back. The thought that kept cycling through her mind was not of anger or revenge, but of simple disbelief. How had it come to this? How had a life spent caring for others led her to this moment of complete abandonment? The distant sound of a church bell tolling the hour reminded her that the world continued turning, even as hers had ground to a halt on this cold bench on a main street in a small Midwestern town. She remained there, utterly still, utterly defeated, As the autumn night grew colder around her, the autumn night grew even colder as Grace huddled on the bench, her thin nightgown offering little protection against the biting wind. The street lights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalks, their harsh glow doing nothing to warm her trembling form. Every passing car's headlights made her shrink further into herself, hoping to become invisible to any curious eyes. Moments later, another set of headlights swept across the bench, but these moved differently. They slowed, then stopped altogether. Through her tears, Grace could make out the sleek silhouette of an expensive car, a Mercedes, she thought, idling at the curb. Her heart began to race, fear mixing with shame at being seen in such a state. Inside the car, Daniel Reeves' hands tightened on the steering wheel as he recognized the figure on the bench. Even in the dim light, there was something familiar about her face. He had seen her before, though he couldn't quite place where. At 58 years old, Daniel was used to making quick decisions, but this one gave him pause. He almost continued driving, almost convinced himself it wasn't his problem, but something, perhaps the memory of his late wife's voice chiding him for his coldness, made him pull over. Grace tried to make herself smaller on the bench, turning her face away from the car's harsh lights. The sound of a car door opening and closing echoed in the quiet street. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. The click of expensive shoes on concrete. Daniel's tall figure emerged from the shadows, his business suit perfectly tailored, his presence commanding even in the darkness. Without hesitation, he removed his wool coat, a fine garment that probably cost more than Grace had made in a month at her nursing job. The fabric whispered as he moved, and suddenly the warm weight of it settled around her shoulders. "Get in my car now," he said, his voice quiet but brooking no argument. It wasn't a request, it was a command, delivered with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Grace looked up at him, recognition finally clicking into place. She had seen him before, in the newspaper, at charity events she'd worked as a nurse. Daniel Reeve, the millionaire businessman whose name graced building plaques and donation lists throughout town. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Of all the people to find her like this. She hesitated, clutching the warm coat around her shoulders. The wool was soft against her skin, carrying the faint scent of expensive cologne. Daniel stood waiting, his expression unreadable in the darkness. I couldn't possibly," she began, but her voice trailed off as another gust of wind cut through her, making her shiver despite the coat. "You can, and you will," Daniel replied, his tone softening slightly but maintaining its authority. He opened the passenger door of his car, the interior light spilling out onto the sidewalk. The leather seats looked impossibly luxurious compared to the hard wooden bench. Grace found herself rising on shaky legs, her body seeming to move of its own accord. Daniel picked up her small suitcase before she could reach for it, placing it in the trunk with efficient movements. The car door closed behind her with a solid thunk, sealing her into a world of warmth and leather and new car smell. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, his movements precise and controlled. The engine purred to life, and the heater began blowing warm air that made Grace's cold, numbed fingers tingle. She sat very still, afraid to touch anything, aware of how out of place she must look in her thin nightgown and slippers, even with his expensive coat wrapped around her. The car moved smoothly away from the curb, heading toward the outskirts of town where the houses grew larger and further apart. Grace knew that's where his mansion stood. Everyone in town knew about the Reeve estate, though few had ever been inside its gates. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the engine and the soft rush of warm air from the vents. Grace stole glances at her rescuer's profile, noting the stern set of his jaw, the silver at his temples, the way he held himself with perfect posture even while driving. There was something both frightening and reassuring about his presence. Frightening, because of his power and position. Reassuring, because of the decisive way he had acted to help her. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but he was acutely aware of the woman beside him. Her small figure seemed to shrink into his coat, as if trying to disappear. He could sense her discomfort, her embarrassment, but also her desperate gratitude for the warmth and safety of his car. As they drove through the sleeping town, both of them felt the weight of this moment, the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Something had shifted in both their lives, though neither could say exactly what or how. The quiet between them was filled with unasked questions and unspoken fears. The street lights grew fewer and further between as they approached the wealthier district. Grace watched as familiar buildings gave way to large houses set back from the road, their windows dark and uninviting. Each turn brought them closer to the Reeve mansion, and with each turn, her anxiety grew. What would happen when they arrived? What did this stern, wealthy man intend to do with her? Daniel's hands remained steady on the wheel, his expression unchanged, but his mind was racing. What had possessed him to stop? What was he going to do with this woman? He couldn't simply drop her back on the street, but bringing a stranger to his home went against every careful rule he'd built his life around since his wife's death. The plush leather seat cradled Grace's exhausted body, the car's warmth seeping into her bones, making her realize just how cold she had been. Daniel's coat still carried his body heat, and despite her fear and uncertainty, she found herself drawing comfort from its weight around her shoulders. They continued their silent journey through the night, two strangers brought together by circumstance, both aware that this chance encounter would have consequences neither of them could predict. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, leading them toward the Reeve mansion and whatever awaited them there. The massive front door of the Reeve mansion opened silently, revealing a foyer larger than most people's entire homes. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors and richly paneled walls. Grace hesitated at the threshold, suddenly very aware of her bare feet and thin slippers. "Come in," Daniel said, his voice gentler now but still carrying that note of command that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He guided her with a light touch on her elbow, careful not to crowd her as she stepped inside. The living room spread out before them, a study in understated luxury, with its high ceilings and carefully chosen furnishings. A velvet couch in deep burgundy dominated one wall, facing a fireplace large enough to warm the entire space. Grace perched uncertainly on its edge, still wrapped in Daniel's coat, trying to make herself as small as possible. Daniel pressed a button on the wall, and within moments, an elderly woman appeared. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, and despite the late hour, she wore a pressed uniform. "Mrs. Peterson," Daniel addressed her, "would you please bring some tea and extra blankets for our guest?" His tone was polite but firm, brooking no questions about the unusual situation. "Right away, Mr. Reeve," Mrs. Peterson replied, her experienced eyes taking in Grace's disheveled state with professional discretion. The warmth of the room began to seep into Grace's bones, and with it came the comforting scent of cinnamon from somewhere deeper in the house. The familiar aroma reminded her of better days, of home-baked cookies and Sunday afternoons. Her shoulders started to relax slightly, though her hands still clutched the edges of Daniel's coat. Daniel stood by the fireplace, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the expensive Persian rug. He studied Grace's face intently, and she could see something working behind his eyes, as if he were putting together pieces of a puzzle. "I remember you," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice had lost some of its stern edge, replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. "You were Margaret's nurse, weren't you?" During those last weeks, Grace's breath caught in her throat. Yes, she whispered, amazed that he would remember her after all this time. I didn't think. It was years ago. You sang to her. Daniel continued, his gaze distant now. When the pain was worst, you would sing old hymns. It was the only thing that seemed to help her sleep. Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. She remembered those nights clearly, sitting beside Margaret's bed, holding her hand, singing softly as the moon cast shadows through the hospital window. She had done it instinctively, wanting to offer whatever comfort she could to the dying woman and her grieving husband. Mrs. Peterson returned with a tray, setting it on the coffee table before Grace. Steam rose from a delicate porcelain teapot, and the scent of cinnamon grew stronger. The housekeeper draped several soft blankets over the back of the couch, then quietly withdrew. Daniel moved closer, settling into an armchair across from Grace. I always regretted not thanking you properly, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Those moments of peace you gave her, they meant everything. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the teacup. It was my privilege, she managed to say. Margaret was special. Anyone could see that. Yes, she was. Daniel agreed quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of the woman who had touched their lives in different ways. Grace sipped her tea, letting its warmth spread through her chest. The reality of her situation began to sink in. Here she was, in Daniel Reeves' mansion, wearing his coat, drinking tea from his fine china. The absurdity of it made her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I should go in the morning, she said quickly, setting down the cup. I've already imposed too much. You will stay. Daniel cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. At least for tonight, the guest room is already being prepared. Grace wanted to protest, but exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm her. The events of the evening, Brenda's harsh words, being thrown out, the cold bench, Daniel's unexpected rescue, all of it crashed over her like a wave. Mrs. Peterson appeared again, as if summoned by some silent signal. The blue room is ready, sir, she announced. Shall I show our guest up? Daniel nodded, rising from his chair. Get some rest, he told Grace. We can talk more tomorrow. Grace stood on shaky legs, clutching one of the blankets around her shoulders along with Daniel's coat. As she followed Mrs. Peterson toward the grand staircase, she glanced back at Daniel. He stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. The blue room turned out to be larger than any bedroom Grace had ever occupied. Moonlight filtered through floor-length curtains, illuminating a four-poster bed with crisp white linens. A small fire crackled in yet another fireplace, and fresh flowers sat on the bedside table. The bathroom is through there. Mrs. Peterson indicated a door. You'll find everything you need. Sleep well, dear. Left alone, Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, still trembling with gratitude and disbelief. The mattress was cloud-soft beneath her, and the room smelled of lavender and fresh linens. She carefully laid Daniel's coat across a nearby chair, smoothing its wool surface with reverent hands. As she slipped between the sheets, their cool crispness a balm against her skin, Grace found herself overwhelmed by the strange turn her life had taken. Just hours ago, she had been homeless and hopeless on a cold bench. Now she lay in a mansion, surrounded by luxury, saved by the kindness of a man who remembered her small act of compassion from years ago. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, tears of relief, of gratitude, of lingering fear and uncertainty. The ceiling above her blurred as she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she was safe, warm, and inexplicably cared for. Morning light filtered through the delicate lace curtains, casting intricate patterns across Grace's face. She blinked awake slowly, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back. The cruel dismissal from her cousin's house, the cold bench, and Daniel Reeves' unexpected rescue. A soft knock at the door made her sit up straight. Mrs. Peterson's gentle voice called through the wood. "Miss Wilkins, I've brought you something to wear for breakfast." Grace wrapped the plush bedding around herself and padded to the door. The housekeeper stood there, with a neatly folded silk robe in a soft shade of blue. "Mrs. Reeves," she explained quietly. "Mr. Reeve thought you might need it." Grace's fingers trembled as she touched the luxurious fabric. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." "Mr. Reeve insists," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "He's waiting for you in the breakfast room whenever you're ready." After freshening up in the marble bathroom, Grace slipped the robe over her nightgown. The silk felt foreign against her skin, too fine for someone like her. She caught her reflection in the full-length mirror, a woman out of place, wearing borrowed elegance. The breakfast room proved to be a sun-filled space with windows overlooking manicured gardens. Daniel sat at the head of a polished table, reading a newspaper. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," he said, folding the paper away. "I trust you slept well." Grace nodded, hovering uncertainly near the doorway. "Yes, thank you." The room was lovely. "Sit," he commanded, though his tone was gentle. "You need to eat." Mrs. Peterson appeared with a cart laden with covered dishes. The aromas of fresh coffee, warm bread, and something sweet made Grace's stomach rumble traitorously. She perched on the edge of a chair as the housekeeper began serving. "Please," Daniel said, watching as Grace hesitated over the abundant spread. "Don't be shy. You need your strength." Grace managed a small smile and selected a croissant, though her hands shook slightly as she buttered it. The food was exquisite: fresh fruit, fluffy eggs, crisp bacon. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten such a fine breakfast. "We need to discuss your situation," Daniel said after they'd eaten in silence for several minutes. "I propose you stay here while you get back on your feet." Grace nearly choked on her coffee. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly impose." "It's not an imposition," he cut in. "It's practical. You need somewhere to stay. And this house has plenty of room. Unless you have another option." The practical tone of his voice made it hard to argue. Grace stared down at her plate, fighting back tears of shame. "No," she whispered. "I don't have anywhere else." "Then it's settled." Daniel's voice was firm but kind. "Stay as long as you need to sort things out." After breakfast, Grace felt compelled to make herself useful. She found Mrs. Peterson in the kitchen and offered to help with the dishes. The housekeeper seemed surprised but grateful for the assistance. Throughout the day, Grace kept herself busy with small tasks: folding linens, dusting shelves, arranging flowers from the garden. The work felt good, giving her hands purpose and her mind distraction. She noticed Mrs. Peterson watching her with growing approval. As evening approached, Daniel retreated to his study. Grace was helping Mrs. Peterson prepare tea when she heard whispered voices from the servants' hall. Just showed up in her nightgown. "Mr. Reeve brought her in himself. What will people say?" Grace's hands stilled on the teacup she was drying. Of course there would be talk. In a small town like this, news traveled fast. Soon everyone would know about her disgrace. Thrown out by her own family. Taken in like a charity case by Daniel Reeve. She delivered the tea tray to Daniel's study with steady hands, though her heart was racing. He sat in a leather armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied some papers. He thanked her absently, and she slipped away like a shadow. Back in the blue room, Grace sank onto the window seat, clutching the borrowed silk robe around herself. The fabric felt like a costume now, a pretense she couldn't maintain. Tomorrow, the whispers would start. Tomorrow, the judgment would begin. She could imagine the conversations already, the wealthy widower and the homeless nurse. What a scandal! Her cheeks burned with shame. Even Daniel's kindness would be tainted by gossip, twisted into something sordid. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching darkness settle over the manicured grounds. The silk robe slipped slightly, and she clutched it tighter, as if it could shield her from the storm of whispers to come. But nothing could protect her from the truth. She was an outsider here, dependent on charity, and soon the whole town would know just how far she had fallen. In the distance, a church bell tolled the evening hour. Grace closed her eyes, remembering simpler times when she had pride, purpose, and a place in the world. Now she sat in borrowed finery, in a borrowed room, living on borrowed time, until judgment caught up with her at last. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Grace stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the simple dress Mrs. Peterson had helped her find from storage. It wasn't new, but it was clean and presentable, far better than her nightgown from 2 nights ago. Daniel had left an envelope on the breakfast table with $500 and a brief note. For necessities. No arguments. The amount made her hands shake, but she knew she couldn't refuse his help. She needed everything from basic toiletries to proper clothes. Walking into town, Grace felt exposed under the bright autumn Sunday. Main Street looked exactly as it always had. The hardware store with its creaky screen door, the diner with its neon sign, the flower shop bursting with mums and pumpkins. But something had changed. Or rather, she had changed. The bell above Marshall's department store chimed as she entered. Mrs. Marshall, arranging sweaters on a display, looked up and froze. Her eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed. "Good morning," Grace said softly, forcing a smile. Mrs. Marshall merely nodded, watching as Grace selected basic items, underwear, socks, a few modest blouses. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unasked questions. At the pharmacy next door, Grace couldn't ignore the whispers that followed her down the aisles. "That's her, the one staying with Daniel Reeve. I heard she showed up at his door in the middle of the night. Poor Margaret must be rolling in her grave." Grace's cheeks burned as she quickly gathered toiletries. Toothbrush, soap, shampoo. Her hands trembled as she paid, avoiding the cashier's pointed stare. By early afternoon, the whispers had grown louder. Outside the grocery store, she overheard 2 women talking openly. Living under his roof, can you imagine? A single woman with a widower. And after she nursed his wife, the nerve of some people. Always thought she put on airs at the hospital, acting so proper. Grace clutched her shopping bags tighter, hurrying past. Each word felt like a physical blow. These were people she'd known for years, patients she'd cared for, neighbors she'd greeted, fellow church members she'd worshipped beside. The evening church service had always been her refuge. Tonight, she slipped into a back pew, hoping to find peace in familiar hymns and prayers. But even here, she couldn't escape the sideways glances and whispered comments. As the congregation filed out after the service, Mrs. Blackwood, the deacon's wife, cornered her in the vestibule. Her face was pinched with righteous indignation. "Well, Grace Wilkins, I must say, I'm shocked to see you here, given your current living arrangement." Grace's throat tightened. "Mrs. Blackwood, it's not what you think. It's what everyone thinks. The older woman's voice rose sharply. Daniel Reeve is a respected member of this community. His wife was my dear friend. And now you're taking advantage of his kindness, moving into his home like some fortune hunter. Other church members lingered nearby, openly listening. Grace felt the weight of their judgment crushing her. You're tarnishing his reputation, Mrs. Blackwood continued. Have you no shame, no sense of propriety? Tears blurred Grace's vision. Without a word, she pushed past the gathered onlookers and fled into the night. Her feet carried her swiftly along the darkened streets, back toward the mansion on the hill. The shopping bags bounced against her legs as she ran, each step punctuated by a sob. The house loomed before her, windows glowing warmly. Grace fumbled with the key Daniel had given her, barely making it inside before her composure crumbled completely. She sank onto a parlor settee, shopping bags scattered at her feet, and buried her face in her hands. That's how Daniel found her minutes later, or perhaps it was hours. Time had lost meaning in her misery. His footsteps paused in the doorway. Grace. His voice was quiet, but carried that familiar note of command that demanded truth. She looked up, face tear-stained, and saw genuine concern in his expression. I'm so sorry, she whispered. The whole town, they think I'm taking advantage of you, using you. Mrs. Blackwood at church, she said, I'm ruining your reputation. Daniel's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. For a moment, she feared he would agree, would see the wisdom in sending her away to preserve his good name. Instead, he crossed the room and sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Their words don't matter, he said firmly. You're safe here. Such simple words, yet they carried the weight of a promise. Grace turned to stare out the window at the twinkling lights of the town below, the place she'd called home for so many years. Now it felt like hostile territory, full of wagging tongues and cruel assumptions. But here in this room, with Daniel's quiet strength beside her, she felt something she hadn't expected, a flicker of defiance against their judgment. Still, gratitude and shame warred in her heart as she watched distant car headlights trace paths through the darkness, wondering how many of those travelers were even now spreading tales about the fallen nurse and the wealthy widower who took her in. The parlor clock ticked steadily, marking time in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. Grace remained at the window, torn between thankfulness for Daniel's protection and the crushing weight of the town's condemnation. The lights below seemed to mock her with their familiar warmth, reminding her that she no longer truly belonged in their glow. The autumn days melted into a gentle routine at the mansion. Grace found herself falling into a natural rhythm, her hands always finding something that needed tending. The grand house, for all its splendor, had spaces that yearned for a woman's touch. Each morning, she rose early to help Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, prepare breakfast. The kitchen, once cold and efficient, now filled with the aroma of freshly baked muffins and brewing coffee. Grace took special care arranging Daniel's plate, adding sprigs of fresh herbs from the greenhouse and folding his napkin just so. In the formal dining room, she noticed how sunlight caught the dust motes dancing above the polished mahogany table. That first afternoon, she spent hours carefully washing the crystal chandelier, each prism coming alive with rainbow sparkles. The room seemed to exhale, relieved to be properly cared for again. You don't need to do all this, Mrs. Peterson had said, watching Grace arrange fresh flowers in the foyer. Mr. Reeve pays people for such things. But Grace simply smiled, continuing to trim stems and adjust blooms. I like to keep busy, she replied, and flowers bring such life to a room. She worked her way through the mansion, room by room, not changing things exactly, but awakening them. The library's leather chairs received gentle conditioning, their rich brown deepening to a warm glow. Dusty volumes were carefully cleaned and reorganized, their gold leaf titles catching the light once more. In the conservatory, Grace discovered Margaret's collection of orchids, sadly neglected. She spent hours researching their care, nursing the delicate plants back to health. When the first bloom opened, its petals a delicate pink against dark leaves, she felt a connection to the woman who had loved them. Daniel noticed these changes. Though he said little at first, he would pause in doorways, his expression thoughtful, as he observed how Grace had brightened a corner or refreshed a forgotten space. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if heavy drapes had been drawn back to let in the Sunday. One evening, after a particularly satisfying supper of pot roast and apple pie, Daniel lingered at the table instead of retreating to his study as usual. Grace was gathering dishes when he spoke. "You've changed things," he said quietly. Grace's hands stilled on a plate. "I hope I haven't overstepped." "No." Daniel's voice was firm but gentle. "The house, it was becoming a shrine, I think, to memories, to grief." He traced a finger along the tablecloth's edge. "Now it feels like a home again." Grace set the plate down and slowly took her seat again. "Sometimes, we need to honor the past while still living in the present." "Margaret would have liked what you've done," Daniel continued, his eyes distant, "especially with her orchids. She loved those flowers, but I could never keep them alive after." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "Would you tell me about her?" Grace asked softly. "About your life together." Daniel looked surprised, then grateful. He began hesitantly at first, sharing memories of meeting Margaret at a charity gala, of their whirlwind courtship and simple wedding. As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, painting pictures of their shared life. Margaret's passion for gardening, her quiet strength during his early business struggles, her dream of starting a women's shelter. "She saw need everywhere," he said, "and always wanted to help. Even at the end, she was making plans for others." His voice caught. "I've been so focused on preserving everything exactly as she left it, I forgot to live the way she taught me." Grace listened intently, her heart aching for his loss. "Grief can do that," she said gently. "It makes us afraid to move forward, as if changing anything might erase the person we've lost." Daniel nodded slowly. "I've been lonely," he admitted, the words seeming to surprise him. The house was full of people, staff, business associates, charity board members, but empty of real connection. Until he met Grace's eyes across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. The grandfather clock in the hall began to strike, its deep tones counting out midnight's hours. Neither moved as 12 chimes echoed through the house. Grace felt her heart beating in time with the clock's resonant notes. Daniel's expression had softened, the usual stern lines of his face relaxed into something more vulnerable, more open. In that moment, she saw not the wealthy businessman or the grieving widower, but simply a man reaching out for understanding. The final chime faded into silence. Through the dining room windows, moonlight painted silver patterns on the floor. The house seemed to hold its breath, watching these two souls recognize something new and unexpected blooming between them. Daniel's hand rested on the table, inches from Grace's. Neither moved to close the distance, but both felt the possibility hovering in the quiet night air. The moment stretched, delicate as a soap bubble, filled with unspoken words, in tender realizations. The clock's steady ticking marked time's passage as they sat in companionable silence, each aware that their relationship had shifted into something neither had anticipated. The mansion around them felt different too. No longer a museum of memories, but a living space where new stories might unfold. The morning sun streamed through the breakfast room's tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished mahogany table. Grace sat with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching as Daniel methodically spread butter on his toast. Something was on his mind. She could tell by the way he kept glancing at the leather portfolio beside his plate. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about something Margaret and I started years ago," he began, his voice careful but determined. "A foundation to help women in crisis. We had the paperwork drawn up, but..." He paused, taking a slow breath. "She became ill before we could launch it." Grace's heart squeezed at the pain in his voice. "That sounds like a wonderful project," she said softly. Daniel opened the portfolio, revealing yellowed papers covered in Margaret's flowing handwriting. "These are her notes, ideas for programs, services, everything she hoped to accomplish." His fingers traced the faded ink reverently. "I've kept them all this time, but never had the courage to look at them again. Until now." He looked up, meeting Grace's eyes. "Would you help me bring this to life? Your experience as a nurse, combined with your..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your recent circumstances. You understand what women in crisis need better than anyone." Grace's breath caught. The idea of helping other women avoid the desperation she'd faced made her heart race with possibility. But doubt crept in. I don't know anything about running a foundation," she admitted. "Neither do I," Daniel said with a slight smile. "But I know business, and you know people. Together, we might make something extraordinary." Grace reached for one of Margaret's notes, reading the passionate words about creating a safe haven for women who had nowhere else to turn. The mission resonated deeply within her. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll help." Over the next several days, they transformed Daniel's study into their planning headquarters. Papers covered every surface as they sorted through Margaret's vision, combining it with their own ideas. Grace brought her practical knowledge of healthcare and emotional support, while Daniel focused on the business structure and funding. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the study's windows, Grace was reviewing a draft of their mission statement. "It needs a name," she said suddenly, looking up at Daniel across the paper-strewn table. He raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Grace hesitated, then spoke softly. "What about Grace House?" "Not because of me," she added quickly, seeing his surprised expression. "In the Bible, grace means undeserved kindness, God's mercy freely given. That's what we want to offer these women, isn't it? A place where they can receive help and hope, no matter their circumstances." Daniel sat back in his leather chair, studying her face. The name carried layers of meaning. Yes, it represented the biblical concept, but he couldn't ignore how perfectly it described the woman before him, Grace, who had entered his life unexpectedly, bringing warmth and purpose back to his empty house. "Grace House Foundation," he said slowly, testing the words. "It's perfect." They worked through the afternoon, energized by having a name for their vision. Grace's nursing background proved invaluable as they outlined medical services and counseling programs. Daniel's business acumen helped shape the organizational structure and funding strategies. As the day's light began to fade, Grace paused in her note-taking to watch Daniel. He was absorbed in reviewing budget projections, his reading glasses perched on his nose, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. The stern businessman she'd first met was still there, but now she saw so much more. His compassion, his dedication to honoring Margaret's memory, his genuine desire to help others. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly alive. Here was work that mattered, a chance to transform her own painful experiences into something meaningful. She thought of that terrible night on the bench, shivering in her nightgown. How many other women faced similar desperate moments? Now she could help ensure they had somewhere to turn. Daniel looked up, catching her gaze. "What is it?" Grace smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I was just thinking how good it feels to have a purpose again, to know that what we're doing could really make a difference." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Margaret would be pleased to see her dream taking shape like this, and to see it in such capable hands. The compliment brought color to Grace's cheeks. She ducked her head, pretending to organize their scattered papers, but her heart was full. Around them, the study held the comfortable silence of two people completely at ease in each other's company, united in a shared mission. Through the window, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Grace looked at the stacks of plans and notes before them, evidence of days spent working side by side, building something larger than themselves. In helping to create this foundation, she had found more than just purpose. She had found a place where she truly belonged. The morning sun couldn't pierce the cloud of tension hanging over the breakfast table. Daniel sat with the local newspaper spread before him, his jaw tightening as he read. Grace noticed his knuckles whitening around his coffee cup. "Listen to this," he said, his voice controlled but trembling with anger. "Our small town has always prided itself on traditional values, yet recently, a certain prominent widower seems to have forgotten his standing in the community. His questionable live-in guest raises eyebrows among those who remember his late wife's gracious presence." Grace's toast turned to ash in her mouth. She set it down with shaking hands, her appetite vanishing. Daniel continued reading, each word sharp with disgust. One must wonder about the true motivations of this mysterious woman, suddenly appearing in our midst and taking up residence in one of the town's most prestigious homes. Perhaps it's time for concerned citizens to speak up about this unseemly arrangement. "Please stop," Grace whispered, her face burning with shame. The columnist hadn't used their names, but everyone in town would know exactly who the article meant. Outside the dining room window, a group of women walked past, their heads together in obvious gossip. Grace recognized them as church members who used to greet her warmly. Now they barely acknowledged her existence. "I should go," she said quietly, staring at her lap. "I'm causing too much damage to your reputation." Daniel slammed the newspaper down so hard their coffee cups rattled. "Absolutely not." "But Daniel, these are your friends, your community. I heard Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store yesterday. She said I was trying to replace Margaret." Grace's voice cracked. "They think I'm just after your money. Let them think what they want." Daniel growled. "I don't care about appearances." But Grace did care. She cared about the whispers that followed her through town, the way former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Most of all, she cared about what this was doing to Daniel's standing in the community he'd called home for decades. That afternoon, while running errands downtown, she overheard two of Daniel's business associates outside the bank. Reeves lost his mind, one muttered, "Taking in some homeless woman. She's obviously playing him." Margaret would be heartbroken, the other agreed, "That gold digger living in her house, probably going through her things." Grace hurried past, clutching her shopping bag like a shield. The accusations stung worse, because she knew how false they were. She hadn't touched any of Margaret's belongings, and the thought of taking advantage of Daniel's kindness made her sick. At the pharmacy, the whispers followed her down the aisles. "Did you see that article about her? I heard she's trying to get him to change his will. Someone should do something." By the time Grace returned to the mansion, her shoulders ached from the tension of holding herself together. She put away her purchases mechanically, trying to focus on the practical tasks rather than the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Daniel found her in the kitchen, methodically arranging cans in the pantry. "You've been crying," he said flatly. Grace touched her cheek, surprised to find it wet. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." He stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "What happened? In town?" She shook her head, unwilling to repeat the cruel words. Maybe it would be better if I found somewhere else to stay, just until the gossip dies down." "And where would you go?" Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. Grace had no answer. The thought of leaving made her chest ache, not just because she had nowhere else to turn, but because this place, this purpose they'd found together with Grace House, had become so precious to her. "I won't let them drive you away," Daniel said. "Their small-minded gossip doesn't matter to me." "But it should matter," Grace insisted. "You have a position to maintain, a business reputation to protect. The foundation needs you," he cut in. "I need." He stopped abruptly, turning away to stare out the kitchen window. That evening, Grace retreated to her room early. She knelt beside her bed as she had done every night since childhood, clasping her hands tightly. "Lord," she whispered, "please show me what's right. I don't want to hurt Daniel, or damage the work we're trying to do. But staying here," her voice caught, "staying here feels like home, and that scares me, because I know it can't last forever." The moonlight filtered through her window, casting soft shadows on the floor. In the quiet of her room, Grace could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, marking time in the home that had offered her such unexpected sanctuary. "If I'm meant to leave, give me the strength," she prayed. "And if I'm meant to stay." She couldn't finish the thought, too afraid to examine the growing feelings in her heart. "Just show me what's right." The gentle night breeze stirred the curtains, but no clear answer came. Grace remained on her knees, tears sliding down her cheeks, whispering the same words over and over. "Lord, show me what's right." In the stillness of her room, the weight of the town's judgment pressed against her shoulders, while her heart pulled her in another direction entirely. She had found purpose here, helping to build something meaningful. But at what cost to the man who had shown her such kindness? Grace's whispered prayers continued long into the night, seeking guidance while the moon traced its path across the sky, and the mansion settled into its evening quiet around her. The crisp October air nipped at Grace's cheeks as she and Daniel toured yet another empty building. Over the past 3 weeks, they had visited 6 potential locations for Grace House, each one holding promise but not quite right. This 7th building, an old brick hospital wing that had been closed for years, felt different from the moment they stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm rectangles on the worn wooden floors. Grace's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she moved from room to room, her mind already transforming the bare spaces into something welcoming. "The heating system needs work," Daniel noted, ever practical as he jotted notes in his leather-bound notebook. "But the structure is sound." Grace paused in what must have been a waiting room, her arms wrapped around herself. In her mind's eye, she could see it all so clearly. Comfortable chairs arranged in friendly circles, soft blankets draped over the backs, the blank walls transformed into gentle colors, decorated with uplifting messages and artwork. "Here," she said softly, moving to the center of the room. "This is where they'll first come in from the cold." Her voice grew stronger with conviction. "We'll have a station for hot soup right there, by that wall. And quilts, lots of quilts. Some women might not have proper coats when they arrive." She turned to face Daniel, but her vision blurred with sudden tears. "Sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "It's just, I can see it so clearly. Women like me, with nowhere else to turn." Daniel crossed the room in 3 long strides, His hand found hers, warm and steady, squeezing gently. The touch sent a flutter through Grace's chest, but his eyes held nothing but understanding and support. "Tell me more," he encouraged. Grace took a deep breath, gesturing with her free hand. "That corner could be a reading nook, with books and comfortable chairs. And down that hallway, we could set up private counseling rooms. The bigger spaces upstairs would make perfect dormitory-style bedrooms." She realized she was still holding Daniel's hand and started to pull away, but he held firm. "What else?" he asked softly. "A proper kitchen," Grace continued, warming to her subject, "where we can teach cooking classes, basic nutrition. Some of these women might never have had the chance to learn. And a classroom space for job training, computer skills." She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about her enthusiasm. But Daniel was nodding, his expression thoughtful. "Margaret would have loved this," he said quietly. "She always said charity should be more than just handouts. It should be about restoring dignity." Grace squeezed his hand in return. She was a wise woman. They spent another hour exploring the building, Daniel making detailed notes, while Grace's imagination transformed each space. By the time they finished, the autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "This is the one," Daniel declared as they walked back to his car. "I'll have my lawyer start the paperwork tomorrow." Back at the mansion, Grace headed straight to the kitchen. Cooking had become her way of processing emotions, and today's visit had stirred up many. She pulled out ingredients for a simple supper: chicken soup made from scratch, crusty bread she'd baked that morning, and apple crisp for dessert. As she chopped vegetables, she thought about how much her life had changed in just a few months. From sleeping on a park bench to helping create a refuge for other women in crisis. It seemed almost too much to believe. The soup was just starting to simmer when Daniel appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. "Can I help?" he asked, as he did most evenings now. Grace smiled and handed him an apron. "You can slice the bread." They worked together in comfortable silence, moving around each other in the kitchen with an ease that spoke of familiarity. Grace noticed how Daniel had stopped checking his phone constantly during these evening meals, how his perpetual frown had softened into something more peaceful. When they sat down to eat, Daniel surprised her by raising his water glass in a toast. "To Grace House," he said, then added with uncharacteristic emotion, "And to you, Grace." She blushed, ducking her head. "I haven't done anything special." "You've done more than you know." Daniel set his glass down, his expression serious. "When Margaret died, I threw myself into work. Let this house become a tomb of memories. I thought that's what loyalty meant, preserving everything exactly as she left it." Grace listened quietly, her soup growing cold. "But you," he continued, "you came here and brought life back, not by changing things, but by showing me how to honor Margaret's memory while still living." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face. "You've restored more than just this house, Grace. You've restored me." Grace's heart skipped a beat at his words. The warmth in his eyes, the gentleness in his voice, it stirred feelings she'd thought long buried. Could this be what she thought it might be? Was it possible that God was offering her a second chance at love? She stood to clear the dishes, needing a moment to compose herself. In the kitchen doorway, she paused, looking back at Daniel still seated at the table. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but it made her heart flutter all the same. For the first time in years, Grace felt hope blooming in her chest, not just for the women they would help through Grace House, but for herself as well. She lingered there for a moment longer, wondering if perhaps God's plan for her life was bigger and more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. The autumn evening had settled into a peaceful rhythm at the mansion. Grace hummed softly while arranging fresh flowers in the front hall, their sweet fragrance mixing with the scent of apple pie cooling in the kitchen. Everything felt right. The way the last rays of sunlight warmed the polished floors, how Daniel's newspaper rustled from his study, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock marking time. Then came the pounding at the door. The hollow thuds echoed through the entryway, making Grace jump. Before she could reach for the handle, the door burst open. Brenda Wilkins stormed in, her face flushed with anger, designer purse swinging wildly from her arm. "So this is where you've been hiding." Brenda's voice cracked through the peaceful evening like a whip. "Living in luxury, while spreading lies about your own family." Grace stepped back, flowers forgotten in her hands. "Brenda, please. Don't you, Brenda, please me." Her cousin advanced, perfectly manicured finger pointing accusingly. "You always were good at playing the victim, weren't you? Poor, helpless Grace, abandoned by everyone, but I know better." Heavy footsteps approached from the study. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening at the scene before him. "What is the meaning of this?" Brenda's eyes gleamed as she turned to him. "Mr. Reeve, I'm Grace's cousin, and I think there are some things you should know about the woman you've taken in." "This is my home," Daniel said firmly, "and you're trespassing." "Oh, I won't stay long." Brenda's smile was sharp as glass. "I just thought you should know how Grace abandoned her responsibilities to our family, how she refused to help care for our sick aunt, claiming she was too busy, how she's always found ways to manipulate kind-hearted people into supporting her." Grace's hands trembled around the flower stems. "That's not true. Aunt Martha had professional care." "Because you wouldn't help." Brenda's voice rose. "And now here you are, worming your way into another wealthy household. Tell me, Grace, have you already started hinting about inheriting anything?" "That's enough." Daniel's voice was steel. But Brenda wasn't finished. She opened her purse, pulling out several folded papers. "And look what I found when I started asking around town. Quite interesting, reading about your employment history, cousin dear. So many short-term positions, so many sudden departures." Grace felt the color drain from her face. Those jobs, each one had ended because of circumstances beyond her control. Hospital budget cuts, facility closures, family emergencies. But twisted through Brenda's lens, they painted a damning picture. The sound of car doors closing outside drew everyone's attention. Through the front windows, Grace saw several well-dressed men and women climbing out of expensive vehicles. Her heart sank as she recognized members of the charity's board of trustees. "Perfect timing," Brenda said sweetly. "I took the liberty of contacting some interested parties about my concerns." The trustees filed in, their faces grave. The board chairman, Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeve, we need to discuss some urgent matters regarding the foundation." Daniel's jaw tightened. "My office." Grace watched helplessly as they disappeared into the study, Brenda trailing behind with her stack of papers. The heavy door closed, but voices soon carried through the walls. She couldn't make out every word, but phrases floated through clearly enough. "Reputation of the foundation at stake. Cannot risk negative publicity. Question of appropriate living arrangements. Unable to bear it." Grace retreated to the hallway. She sank onto a window seat, her whole body trembling. Everything she'd built here, everything she'd dared to hope for, it was crumbling like sand through her fingers. The voices from the study grew louder. Mr. Peterson's tone was unmistakable. The board cannot continue supporting this project if there's any hint of scandal. Either the living situation changes, or we withdraw our backing completely." Daniel's response was too low to hear, but the chairman's reply rang clear. "It's your choice, Mr. Reeve. The foundation's future or your house guest." Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. The charity meant everything to Daniel. It was Margaret's dream, his way of honoring her memory. She couldn't be the reason it failed. She wouldn't. The meeting dragged on for another hour. When the trustees finally filed out, Brenda among them, Grace had already slipped upstairs to her room. She waited until the house grew quiet, until Daniel's footsteps passed her door without stopping, until the grandfather clock downstairs chimed midnight. Only then did she pull her small suitcase from under the bed. Her hands moved mechanically, folding the few clothes she'd accumulated during her stay. The borrowed robe she laid carefully across the foot of the bed. Last came the dried flower she'd pressed from the first arrangement she'd made for the house. She tucked it into her Bible, between the pages of Psalms. The house creaked and settled around her as she worked, familiar sounds that now felt like goodbye. How many nights had she lain in this bed, listening to those same creaks, feeling safe for the first time in so long? How many mornings had she woken to sunlight through these windows, heart full of purpose and possibility? But she couldn't stay, not when her presence threatened everything Daniel had worked for, not when the whispers and accusations would always follow, casting shadows on his reputation and the foundation's mission. Grace changed into her old dress, the one she'd arrived in, now carefully mended. She tucked her hair under a scarf and picked up her suitcase. It felt lighter than she expected, or maybe that was just her heart, heavy with all she was leaving behind. At the door, she paused. The room looked almost untouched now, as if she'd never been there at all. Only the borrowed robe remained as evidence of her time here, folded neat and clean on the bed. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for the handle. The latch clicked softly, a small sound marking the end of something precious and unexpected. Grace stepped into the dark hallway and quietly closed the door behind her. Dawn was still hours away, plenty of time to slip away unseen, to disappear before she could cause any more damage to the dreams and reputations of others. She would find her way somehow, she always had. But oh, how this leaving hurt, more than all the others combined. The mansion stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness as Grace eased the heavy front door closed behind her. Her breath caught in her throat at the soft click of the latch. Such a quiet sound to mark such a heartbreaking departure. The porch steps creaked under her careful footsteps, each board seeming to protest her leaving. The night air bit through her thin coat, and Grace pulled it tighter around herself. Her small suitcase felt heavier than when she'd arrived, though she carried little more than she'd come with. Perhaps it was the weight of memories making each step harder. Daniel's kind eyes across the breakfast table, warm conversations in the study, shared dreams of helping others through the foundation. Street lights cast pools of yellow light on the empty sidewalks. Grace's shadow stretched long and lonely ahead of her as she walked. The town slept peacefully, unaware of her silent exodus. Windows were dark in the neat houses she passed, curtains drawn against the night. Soon enough, those same windows would be alive with morning gossip about her disappearance. She could almost hear Brenda's satisfied tone. "I knew she wouldn't stay where she wasn't wanted." Her feet carried her past the church where she'd once been welcome, past the shops where whispers had followed her. The clicking of her sensible shoes on concrete echoed in the stillness. Each step put more distance between her and the warmth she'd found in Daniel's home, the purpose she'd discovered in their shared vision for Grace House. The bus station came into view, a small brick building with fluorescent lights humming in the windows. Inside, the space smelled of coffee and disinfectant. A tired-looking clerk sat behind scratched plexiglass, barely glancing up as Grace approached. "One ticket, please," Grace said softly. "On the next bus out." The clerk tapped at a keyboard. 5:15 to Cedar Rapids. $17.50. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she counted out the bills from her thin wallet. The ticket felt flimsy in her fingers, just a piece of paper. But it represented another ending, another closed door. She found a hard plastic seat near the timetable board, setting her suitcase carefully beside her. The electronic display flickered, numbers changing in harsh red light. 5:15 seemed both too soon and an eternity away. Grace watched the minutes tick by, each one carrying her closer to another uncertain beginning. Other early travelers began filtering in, clutching coffee cups and overnight bags. None met her eyes. She was grateful for their indifference. No judgmental stares, no whispered comments about the woman who'd taken advantage of Daniel Reeves' kindness. Daniel. Her heart ached at the thought of him waking to find her gone. Would he understand why she had to leave? Would he know that she'd done it to protect him, to preserve Margaret's legacy through the foundation? She hoped the folded note she'd left, with the borrowed robe, would explain enough. Back at the mansion, dawn was beginning to paint the sky in pale streaks. Daniel stirred in his sleep, some instinct pulling him from dreams earlier than usual. Something felt wrong. The house seemed emptier somehow, though he couldn't say why. He rose, drawn to check on Grace as he often did in the early hours. The habit had started weeks ago, after finding her one morning in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast. The sight of her moving quietly through his home, bringing life back to rooms that had been cold for so long, had become precious to him. But today, the guest room door stood slightly ajar. Daniel's heart stuttered as he pushed it open. The bed was perfectly made, corners crisp as if no one had ever slept there. On top lay his late wife's robe, the one he'd given Grace to use, folded with careful precision. A note rested on the silk fabric. Daniel's hands shook as he unfolded it, reading Grace's neat handwriting. "Dear Daniel, I cannot be the reason your foundation fails. Margaret's dream deserves to live on, untainted by gossip and scandal. Thank you for showing me kindness when I needed it most. I will never forget." "No," he whispered, the paper crumpling in his grip. Panic rose in his chest as the full meaning of her absence hit him. Without Grace, the foundation would be just another charity, cold and impersonal. Without her gentle presence, his home would return to being merely a house, filled with echoes and memories. He rushed to the phone, punching numbers with desperate force. "James," he barked when his driver answered. "Get here now. We're going to the bus station." While he waited, Daniel paced the foyer, each second feeling like an eternity. The sun was rising properly now, painting the windows with gold. How many mornings had he watched Grace tend to the flowers in that same light? How many evenings had they spent planning the foundation, her face animated with passion for helping others? He couldn't lose her, not like this. Not to small-minded gossip and threats from people who couldn't see past appearances to the truth of her heart. The sound of tires on gravel brought him rushing outside. James had barely stopped the car before Daniel yanked open the door. "The bus station," he ordered. Quickly, as they drove through the awakening town, Daniel's mind raced. What if he was too late? What if she'd already gone? The thought of Grace disappearing into the world again, alone and hurting, was unbearable. At the station, Grace sat watching the minutes tick away on the board. 5:05. Her bus would begin boarding soon. Other passengers were already lining up, tickets in hand. She should join them, she knew. Instead, she remained frozen in her seat, feeling the weight of everything she was leaving behind. The timetable board flickered again. 5:10. Soon she would board a bus and leave this town, these dreams, this almost love behind. Grace gripped her suitcase handle tighter, unaware that at that very moment, a black car was speeding through the streets toward her, carrying a man who had finally realized some things were worth fighting for. The ancient bus engine groaned to life, its deep rumble echoing through the nearly empty station. Grace felt the sound vibrate through the hard wooden bench, like a countdown to her departure. She clutched her worn suitcase closer, her knuckles white against the handle. Through the station's grimy windows, the morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked tile floor. A few sleepy passengers shuffled toward the boarding area, tickets in hand. Grace knew she should join them, but her legs felt like lead. The screech of tires outside barely registered until she heard it. His voice, deep and commanding, cutting through the quiet morning air. "Grace!" Daniel's shout echoed off the station's high ceiling. "Grace!" Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, hardly daring to believe, and there he was, Daniel Reeve, successful businessman and pillar of the community, disheveled and breathing hard as he burst through the station doors. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, his silver hair uncombed. He looked nothing like the collected man she'd come to know. "Daniel?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He strode toward her, ignoring the curious stares of other passengers. "Stopping you from making a terrible mistake." Grace stood shakily, her face flushing with emotion. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be. I have to go. You know I do. Your trustees were clear." "The foundation." "Hang the trustees," Daniel interrupted, his voice rough with feeling. Other travelers had stopped to watch, forming a loose circle around them. "Hang what anyone thinks, but your reputation," Grace protested, wringing her hands. "Everything you've built. I can't be the reason it all falls apart. The foundation is too important. Margaret's dream means too much." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes intense. "You're right, the foundation is important, but do you know why?" Grace shook her head mutely. "Because it's about helping people who have been kicked down by life. People who deserve a second chance." His voice softened. "People like you, Grace." Tears began to well in her eyes. "Daniel, please." To her astonishment, and the gasps of onlookers, Daniel slowly lowered himself to one knee before her. The proud, powerful man who commanded boardrooms and managed millions was kneeling on the dirty bus station floor, looking up at her with naked emotion in his eyes. "The world may have kicked you out naked," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed station. "But you clothed my heart with hope. You're not my burden, Grace. You're my miracle." A sob escaped her throat. Tears streamed freely down her face now, but she couldn't look away from his earnest expression. "Every morning," Daniel continued, "I wake up and my house feels like a home again. The rooms that were shrines to my grief are full of life. You did that, Grace. You brought warmth back into my life when I thought I'd never feel it again." Through the windows, the bus driver revved the engine impatiently, but Grace barely heard it, transfixed by Daniel's words. "The trustees, the gossips, the newspaper columnists, they don't see what I see," he went on. "They don't see how you spend extra hours helping the housekeeper because you hate to see anyone overwhelmed. They don't see you in the garden, talking to Margaret's roses like they're old friends. They don't see the way you've honored her memory better than all my money ever could." Grace's legs trembled. "I'm nobody," she whispered, "just a former nurse who lost her way." "You're everything," Daniel countered firmly. Your kindness when the world is cruel. Your strength wrapped in gentleness. You're the answer to prayers I was too bitter to pray. The bus horn blared, making several onlookers jump, but Daniel didn't flinch, didn't look away from Grace's tear-stained face. Stay, he pleaded softly. Stay, and help me build something beautiful. Stay and show this town what real grace looks like. Stay and, he paused, swallowing hard, and let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Grace's heart thundered in her chest. Around them, the small crowd of witnesses seemed to hold their collective breath. Through the windows, she could see the bus beginning to pull away from the curb, taking with it her planned escape. Daniel's hand reached up toward her, strong and steady. What do you say, Grace? Will you trust me enough to stay? Her tears fell faster as she looked at his outstretched hand. In it, she saw more than just an offer of help. She saw hope, purpose, and the promise of love she'd thought was forever beyond her reach. With trembling fingers, Grace placed her hand in his. Daniel's grip was warm and sure as he rose to his feet, drawing her gently up with him. Behind them, the bus pulled away from the station, its engine noise fading into the distance. They stood there, hand in hand, as the morning sun streamed through the windows, painting them both in golden light. Grace's small suitcase lay forgotten at her feet, no longer needed for an escape that would never happen. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mansion's circular driveway as Daniel's car pulled up to the entrance. Grace sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, still processing the whirlwind of emotions from the bus station. The grand house looked different to her now. Not just a temporary shelter, but potentially her future home. Daniel turned off the engine and reached over to squeeze her hand. Ready? Grace managed a small nod, though her heart fluttered nervously. It feels like a dream. It's real, he assured her, his voice gentle. Every bit of it. They walked up the front steps together, Daniel carrying her small suitcase. As they entered the foyer, Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, emerged from the kitchen with a concerned expression that quickly shifted to relief when she saw Grace. Call everyone to the main parlor, please, Daniel requested, his tone carrying the quiet authority she'd grown familiar with. I have an important announcement. While Mrs. Peterson hurried off, Grace touched Daniel's arm. Are you sure about this? He turned to face her fully, his eyes serious. More sure than I've been about anything in years. Within minutes, the household staff gathered in the parlor. Mrs. Peterson, the groundskeeper Mr. Thompson, the cook Mrs. Barnes, and the two maids, Jenny and Sarah. Their faces showed varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension as they arranged themselves near the fireplace. Daniel stood tall, keeping Grace's hand firmly in his. I want to introduce you all to someone very special, he began, his voice clear and strong, not as our guest, but as the woman I love and intend to marry. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. Jenny's eyes widened, while Mrs. Peterson pressed a hand to her chest. Mr. Thompson's weathered face remained carefully neutral. Miss Grace Wilkins has brought light back into this house, Daniel continued, and into my life. I know there have been rumors and speculation about her presence here. Today, I want to make my intentions absolutely clear. Grace felt her cheeks warming. As all eyes turned to her, she saw skepticism in some faces, particularly Sarah's, who had always been a bit distant. But Mrs. Barnes was beaming, and Mrs. Peterson's eyes had grown suspiciously misty. Some of you may remember when she cared for Margaret, Daniel added softly. She showed the same compassion and dignity than that she shows now. I trust you'll all treat her with the respect she deserves as the future mistress of this house. Mrs. Peterson was the first to step forward. "Miss Grace," she said warmly, taking Grace's free hand between both of hers. "I always thought you brought something special to this home. Welcome, truly welcome." One by one, the staff offered their congratulations. Mrs. Barnes hugged her impulsively, whispering, "About time he found happiness again." Mr. Thompson gave a gruff but sincere handshake. Even Sarah managed a small smile and nod. As the staff dispersed to their duties, many with wondering glances over their shoulders, Mrs. Barnes announced she would prepare a special dinner to celebrate. The smell of roasting chicken and herbs soon filled the house, making it feel more like home than ever. Daniel led Grace to the dining room, pulling out her chair with careful attention. The table had been set with Margaret's best china, something that might have once pained Grace to see, but now felt like a blessing, a bridge between past and future. "I was thinking," Daniel said as they settled into their meal, "about the foundation." Grace looked up quickly. "You still want to proceed with it?" "More than ever," he replied firmly. "But not as some wealthy benefactor helping the less fortunate. I want us to build it together, as equals. Your experience, your compassion, they're worth more than any check I could write." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. "The women who come to us, they'll need to know they're not alone, that someone understands." "Exactly." Daniel reached across the table to take her hand. "Who better to show them that than someone who's walked their path? You're not just my partner in life, Grace. You're my partner in this mission." Grace's voice wavered as she spoke. "When I was sitting in that bus station, ready to leave, I thought I was doing the right thing, sacrificing my happiness to protect your work, your reputation. And now I see that sometimes what looks like sacrifice is really just fear in disguise." She squeezed his hand. "God had a bigger plan than either of us could see." After dinner, they sat together in the study, surrounded by the papers and plans they'd drawn up for Grace House. What had once felt like an impossible dream now seemed within reach. The warm lamplight cast a gentle glow over their work, and Grace felt a deep peace settle over her. As Daniel reviewed some documents, Grace folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered her prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me home. Thank you for turning my mourning into dancing. Thank you for showing me that your grace is bigger than my shame, your love stronger than my fear." The tears fell onto her clasped hands, but these were different from the tears she'd shed on that cold night when she'd been cast out. These were tears of joy, of wonder, of profound thankfulness for the mysterious ways God could turn tragedy into triumph. The autumn wind whistled through the streets as Grace stood in the middle of what would soon be Grace House's main reception area. Paint fumes lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of fresh lumber and cleaning supplies. She ran her hand along a newly painted wall, the soft cream color warming the space that had once been cold and empty. "I think we need another coat here," she called out to Daniel, who was inspecting the window frames across the room. "Whatever you think is best," he replied, smiling at her attention to detail. "You have the eye for these things." Over the past weeks, they had transformed the old brick building into something beautiful. What started as a dusty, abandoned space now held promise in every corner. Comfortable chairs lined the walls, arranged in welcoming clusters. A collection of quilts, donated by local church members who had come around to their cause, added splashes of color to the room. Mrs. Peterson appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "The delivery truck just arrived with the kitchen supplies," she announced, "and more volunteers are here to help unpack." Grace nodded, wiping paint from her hands. I'll be right there. The kitchen was bustling with activity when she arrived. Women from various church groups, some who had once whispered behind her back, now worked alongside her, unpacking boxes of plates, cups, and cooking utensils. The steel countertops gleamed under the new fluorescent lights, and the industrial-sized stove stood ready to provide warm meals for those in need. "These soup bowls are perfect," commented Martha Williams, a deacon's wife who had initially been among Grace's harshest critics. Now she carefully arranged the white ceramic bowls on shelves, her earlier judgment replaced by genuine support. "Thank you for helping," Grace said softly, touching Martha's arm. "It means so much." Martha paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I was wrong about you, Grace. We all were. What you and Daniel are doing here, it's truly God's work." Throughout the afternoon, more volunteers arrived. They assembled bunk beds in the upstairs dormitory, organized clothing donations in the basement, and stocked the pantry with non-perishable foods. Every corner of Grace House was coming alive with purpose. Daniel found Grace in the small chapel they had created, where she was arranging hymnals in the book rack of each chair. "The sign company just finished installing the main entrance sign," he said. "Want to see it?" They walked outside together, hand in hand. The autumn sun caught the gold lettering that spelled out Grace House above the door. Beneath it, smaller letters read, "Where mercy meets need." "It's perfect," Grace whispered, squeezing Daniel's hand. But their moment of satisfaction was interrupted by angry voices approaching from down the street. A group of about 20 people marched toward them, carrying hastily made signs. Grace's heart sank as she read them. "Keep our town respectable," and "No handouts for vagrants." Leading the group was Theodore Barnes, a prominent businessman known for his conservative views. "Mr. Reeve," he called out, his voice carrying across the sidewalk, "this establishment will bring nothing but trouble to our community. We don't need outside elements disturbing our peace." Grace felt herself shrinking inside, the old shame threatening to return. But Daniel's grip on her hand tightened reassuringly. "What peace would that be, Mr. Barnes?" Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "The peace of turning a blind eye to suffering. The peace of pretending poverty doesn't exist in our own backyard." The protesters gathered closer, their signs waving. Someone in the back shouted, "They'll come from all over. Criminals and addicts. They'll come because they need help." Daniel responded, his voice growing stronger. "Just as we all need help sometimes. This foundation isn't just about providing shelter. It's about restoring dignity to those who have lost everything." Grace watched as Daniel addressed the crowd, his presence commanding attention. But something stirred inside her, a need to speak, to share her truth. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward. "I was one of those undesirables you're so afraid of," she said, her voice shaking at first but growing steadier with each word. 3 months ago, I was thrown out of my cousin's house in nothing but a nightgown. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I sat on a bench in the cold, thinking my life was over. The protesters fell silent, several lowering their signs as they listened. But God sent help through Daniel, Grace continued. He showed me mercy when others showed judgment. And now I stand before you as living proof that compassion changes lives. She gestured to the building behind her. Grace House isn't just a charity, it's a second chance. Every woman who comes through these doors could be your sister, your daughter, your friend. They're not criminals or vagrants. They're human beings who need what we all need: hope. Martha Williams, who had come outside to investigate the commotion, stepped forward from the building's entrance. "Grace is right," she declared, moving to stand beside her. "I was wrong to judge her. and we're wrong to judge others who need help." A murmur went through the crowd. Theodore Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his sign lowering slightly. From somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap. Then another joined in, and another, until the applause spread through the group. Grace felt tears in her eyes as she watched several protesters drop their signs. Some even stepped forward to ask how they could help. Theodore Barnes remained stone-faced, but his supporters had dwindled to just a handful. "The doors open tomorrow at 9 o'clock, Grace announced, her voice now clear and confident. "Anyone who wants to be part of this mission is welcome to join us." As the crowd dispersed, some lingering to speak with Daniel about volunteering, Grace stood in amazement at what had just happened. The voice that shame had once silenced now carried strength she never knew she possessed. In standing up for others, she had found her own power. Daniel came to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You were magnificent," he whispered. Grace leaned into him, watching as the last of the protesters disappeared down the street. The setting sun cast long shadows across Grace House's front steps, but tomorrow those steps would welcome women seeking refuge, hope, and a chance at a new beginning, just as she had found. Her voice, once broken by circumstance, had become an instrument of change. In that moment, Grace understood that her story wasn't just about personal redemption. It was about the transformative power of love and mercy, a testimony that would echo through every life touched by Grace House. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the restored brick building. Fresh paint gleamed on the trim, and newly planted flowers bobbed their heads in the gentle breeze. A red satin ribbon stretched across the entrance of Grace House, catching the light like a promise about to be fulfilled. Grace stood before the mirror in her room at Daniel's mansion, smoothing the fabric of her modest blue dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened a small pearl necklace, a gift from Daniel for this special day. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror seemed transformed from the desperate figure who had huddled on a bench just months ago. "Are you ready?" Daniel appeared in the doorway, distinguished in his dark suit. Grace took a deep breath. "I think I've been ready for this my whole life. I just didn't know it." They drove to Grace House together, arriving to find the sidewalk already filling with people. Television crews set up their cameras, while reporters clutched notepads. The crowd was a mix of curious onlookers, supporters, and, most importantly, several women who would become the first residents of Grace House. Sarah, now the official house manager, greeted them at the side entrance. "Everything's perfect inside," she reported. "The rooms are ready, the kitchen stocked, and the welcome packets are all prepared." Grace squeezed her hand in gratitude. Together, they had transformed the old building into a warm, welcoming haven. Each bedroom had been carefully furnished with comfortable beds, cheerful curtains, and personal touches that spoke of dignity and care. The common areas held soft couches and chairs arranged for conversation, while the kitchen gleamed with new appliances ready to nourish both bodies and souls. As 10 o'clock approached, the crowd grew larger. Grace recognized faces from church, the garden club, and local businesses, many who had initially opposed the project, but now stood in support. Even a few former protesters had come, their expressions softened with curiosity, and perhaps a touch of shame. The mayor stepped forward to begin the ceremony, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Today marks a new chapter in our town's history," he announced. "Thanks to the vision and generosity of Daniel Reeve and the compassionate leadership of Grace Wilkins, we open a door of hope for women in crisis." Grace felt Daniel's hand slip into hers as they moved toward the ribbon. Someone handed them a large pair of ceremonial scissors. The metal felt cool against Grace's palm as they positioned the blades. Together, Daniel whispered. With a clean snip, the red ribbon fluttered to the ground. Applause erupted from the crowd, accompanied by cheers and a few happy tears. The first women to enter were those who would be calling Grace's house home. Grace greeted each one personally, seeing in their eyes the same mix of fear and hope she had felt that cold night when Daniel found her. There was Maria, barely 20, clutching a small backpack containing everything she owned. Eleanor, in her 50s, recently widowed and lost. Jenny, escaping an abusive relationship, her shoulders gradually relaxing as she stepped into the safe space. "Welcome home," Grace said to each one, the words carrying all the weight of her own journey. The public toured the facility in small groups, exclaiming over the cheerful rooms and thoughtful amenities. Reporters asked questions about capacity, programs, and future plans. Daniel handled the practical queries while Grace spoke about the heart of their mission. "Every woman who comes through these doors will find not just shelter," she explained to a journalist, "but a chance to rebuild her life with dignity and support." As afternoon mellowed into evening, the crowds thinned. The new residents began settling into their rooms, unpacking small belongings, and beginning to relax into the promise of safety. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, offering assistance and gentle words of encouragement. Daniel found Grace in the kitchen, where she was arranging cookies on a platter for the evening's informal welcome gathering. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his strength. "Margaret would be so proud," he whispered into her hair. "This was her dream, but you've made it even more beautiful than she imagined." Grace turned in his embrace, touching his cheek softly. "She started this path. I'm just honored to help finish it." As dusk painted the sky in soft purples and deep blues, Grace and Daniel sat on the front steps of Grace's house. Through the windows behind them, warm light spilled out into the gathering darkness. They could hear gentle conversation, an occasional laugh, the sounds of life and healing beginning to fill the spaces. Grace wiped happy tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here. From that desperate night on the bench to this moment of triumph and purpose, it seemed both an eternity and a blink of an eye. "Look up," Daniel said softly. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, pinpricks of light in the vast expanse. Grace leaned against Daniel's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "Our second chance is just beginning," she whispered. Daniel's arm tightened around her as they sat together, watching the stars multiply above them. The windows of Grace's house glowed like earthbound stars behind them, each light representing a woman's journey toward hope and renewal. In that moment, Grace felt the perfect rightness of it all, the ending that was really a beginning, the love that had grown from mercy, the purpose that had emerged from pain. They sat in comfortable silence, counting stars and blessings, certain that their shared journey was only just beginning. The evening shadows lengthened as the last of the opening day guests made their way down the path from Grace's house. Their footsteps faded into the quiet of the settling night, leaving behind a building humming with new beginnings. Grace and Daniel walked the hallways together, their soft footfalls echoing on the hardwood floors. Every room now held purpose: beds topped with colorful quilts, small bedside tables with battery-operated lamps, and dressers ready to hold new lives. From one room came the gentle sounds of a baby's coos. Grace paused in the doorway, seeing a young mother, barely 20, trying to settle her infant while perched uncertainly on the edge of her bed. Her eyes held that familiar look of fear, mixed with desperate hope. "May I?" Grace asked softly, stepping inside. The young woman nodded, and Grace reached for a thick blanket. With gentle movements, she tucked it around both mother and child. "The nights can feel long when you're scared," she whispered, "but you're safe here now, both of you." Daniel watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with pride at Grace's natural ability to comfort. This was why the foundation needed her. Not just her organization skills, but her deep understanding of what it meant to need shelter in a storm. In the kitchen, Mrs. Alvarez was preparing tea for the remaining volunteers. The housekeeper's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she arranged cups on a tray. When Grace entered, Mrs. Alvarez's face softened with genuine warmth. "Miss Grace," she said, pressing a cup into Grace's hands, "you've brought such life back to us all, not just to Mr. Reeves' home, but to this whole town. I was wrong to doubt you at first." Outside on the porch, Grace found several townspeople still lingering. Women who had once whispered behind their hands now approached with downcast eyes and quiet apologies. Others pressed small donations into her hands, crumpled bills and coins, given with newly opened hearts. Standing beneath the warm glow of the porch lantern, Grace felt Daniel's arm slip around her waist. Together they watched the last of the townsfolk leave, understanding that this night marked more than their personal redemption. They had created something that would extend far beyond their own lives, a legacy of mercy that would continue to heal broken spirits long after they were gone. In that moment, Grace felt the last shadows of her old shame finally fade away, replaced by the steady light of purpose. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.